time, we're going to take a look at the subject, the lesson from the fig tree, so that we can understand two really important things. This time, we're going to figure out when the second coming Christ will come, and we're going to find out how we can know who he is specifically. Now, in case you didn't join us for previous webinars, let me brief you on what we talked about. We studied that the second coming of Christ and the judgment day are not the same. They are different days. He comes in the clouds, which means the flesh, right? So now, in order to receive the second coming Christ, what we need to do is we need to find out the prophecies about him in the Bible. He comes a second time in order to gather his elect. So if we want to be the elect who receive salvation, then we have to know who the second coming Christ is. So how can we do that? God has given us the Bible as a book that testifies about Christ. In other words, it lets us identify who he is exactly so we can receive him. The way that the Bible testifies about Christ is like this. The prophecies of the Bible were written down beforehand by the prophets, inspired by God. And then they predict the characteristics of the Christ. So when you look at the prophecies and then you see who fulfills the prophecies, you can know with 100% certainty who he really is, and you can receive the true Christ. Today, among many prophecies about the second coming Christ, we're going to study about when he comes a second time, through the lesson from the fig tree. Now, we can't know when the judgment day is, but remember, the second coming is not the judgment day. It happens before the judgment day, right? So we can know when the second coming Christ is to happen. Jesus gave us the lesson from the fig tree in order to let us know that incredible fact. And it lets us understand the characteristic of the true Christ so that you and I can receive him and enter the kingdom of heaven where we all want to go. Now, of course, the Bible doesn't say that there's like an exact year. It doesn't say 19 something something the second coming Christ will appear. But what the Bible does say is that there is a decisive sign that coincides with his second coming. So when we know what that decisive sign is, we will be able to know the year that second coming Christ was to appear according to the prophecies. So let's figure it out one by one together. Let's go to Matthew 24, verse 3. As Jesus was sitting on Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. "Tell us," they said, "when will this happen? And what will be the what? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So the disciples asked Jesus, "What will be the sign of your coming?" And Jesus answers them in verse 32. Let's go to verse 32. "Now learn this lesson from what? From the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things," what are these things? He said, when the fig tree's twigs get tender and its leaves come out. "Even so, when you see all these things, the fig tree's twigs getting tender and its leaves coming out, you know that it is near, right at the door." Jesus told us to learn the lesson from the fig tree. Why? Because if we learn it, it says you can know when it is near, right at the door. What is it? This refers to the event of his second coming. That's why if you look at the footnote, it says, "or he," indicating the second coming of Jesus. That means if we know the lesson from the fig tree, when its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you and I can know when Christ is to be right at the door for his second coming. That's an amazing fact that we have to know. It's because when he comes a second time, what does he do? He gathers his elect, right? So since he gathers his elect, if we don't receive him, it's not possible for us to be those elect. So we have to know this lesson from the fig tree so that we can receive him correctly. Now, in order to learn the lesson from the fig tree, let's read the verse one more time and then find out some important things. Verse 32. "Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door." So to learn the lesson from the fig tree so we can know when Jesus comes a second time, we need to find out three important things that Jesus mentioned in here. So first, we need to know, what does the fig tree mean? And second, we need to know, what does it mean for the fig tree's twigs to get tender and its leaves to come out? And third, we need to know what it means for him to be right at the door. If we find out these three things, we're going to be able together to know the lesson from the fig tree, and therefore, we're going to be able to receive the true second coming Jesus and enter the kingdom of heaven. It's exciting, right? So first of all, what does the fig tree mean? In the Bible, the fig tree is consistently a symbol for the nation of Israel. So when Jesus said, learn a lesson from the fig tree, it means there's some secret hidden in the history of Israel. And number two, what does it mean for the twigs to get tender and its leaves to come out? What this means is that the fig tree was there, okay? And then the fig tree must wither. And then after that, its twigs get tender and its leaves come out. In other words, it blooms or it revives. Jesus mentioned that the fig tree's twigs would get tender and its leaves would come out, right? So this implies that it was in the state or the condition where it was not blooming, so that its twigs will get tender and its leaves will come out, and that's a noticeable sign that lets us know about the second coming Christ. So it means the fig tree was there, it withers, and then its twigs get tender and its leaves come out later. So what does it mean for the fig tree to wither? And what does it mean for the fig tree's twigs to get tender and its leaves to come out? Let's pay attention through the teachings of Jesus in the Bible one by one. First, let's together find out what it means for the fig tree to wither. To do this, we're going to find out from three different cases of Jesus' prophecy in the Bible. Number one, we're going to take a look at his practical lesson with the fig tree. Second, we're going to take a look at his parable of the fig tree. And third, we're going to see his direct prophecy. Let's start with Jesus' practical lesson with the fig tree by going to Mark chapter 11, verse 12. The next day, as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree and leaf, he went out to find out if it had any fruit. When he reached it, he found nothing but leaves, because it was not the season for figs. So Jesus found no fruit on the fig tree because it wasn't the season. Let's read the next verse. Then he said to the tree, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard him say it. So Jesus cursed the fig tree because it had no fruit, since it wasn't the season. And then what happened after? Let's go to verse 20. In the morning as they went along, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots. Peter remembered and said to Jesus, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed has withered." Jesus went to a fig tree and he found no fruit on it. What was the reason? It's because it wasn't the season, right? Jesus, being God and the creator of this fig tree, definitely knew that it would have no figs on it, but he cursed it nonetheless. So Jesus must have been trying to show us something through this. He wasn't just doing it randomly. Then what is he trying to show us? The fig tree represents Israel. So the fact that the fig tree was cursed shows that Israel would be cursed and punished. Now let's go to Jesus' parable of the fig tree by going to Luke chapter 13. Luke chapter 13, verse 6. Then he told this parable. A man had a fig tree growing in his vineyard, and he went to look for fruit on it, but did not find any. So he said to the man who took care of the vineyard, "For how many years?" "For 3 years now, I've been coming to look for fruit on this fig tree and haven't found any. Cut it down. Why should it use up the soil?" Here, Jesus said a parable about the fig tree. In the parable, a man had a fig tree and he went to look for fruit on it, but didn't find any. Reminds us of what we just read in Mark chapter 11, right? Judging from what happened in Mark chapter 11, we can know that this man in the parable is Jesus himself. Another clue that this is Jesus himself is the 3 years. The man looked for fruit on the fig tree for how long? For 3 years, right? How long did Jesus preach the gospel in Israel? It was 3 years. So this man in the parable is definitely Jesus. The man looking for fruit for 3 years on the fig tree represents that Jesus would preach the gospel in Israel for 3 years. So we can easily know that the fig tree represents Israel. Then what does it mean that he would find no fruit and then have it cut down? It means that Jesus preached the gospel in Israel for 3 years, but they rejected Jesus. The cutting down of the fig tree shows that Israel would be punished. We've taken a look at the practical lesson of Jesus, and we've taken a look at the parable of Jesus. Now let's take a look at his direct prophecy about the fall of Jerusalem. Let's go to Luke chapter 21, verse 20. Luke 21, verse 20. When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those in the city get out, and let those in the country not enter the city. For this is the time of punishment in fulfillment of all that has been written. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. There will be great distress in the land and wrath against this people. They will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. Jesus clearly and directly said that Jerusalem would be desolated. Okay? Desolated means destroyed. Now, if Jerusalem is destroyed, what does that mean? That means that is also the destruction of Israel. It's because Jerusalem is the capital city of Israel. Jesus directly prophesied it. Did it happen? In fact, it did. Let's read one history book. This is from the Illustrated History of the World, Volume 3, Rome and the Classical West. Between 66 and 74 CE, the Jews rebelled against Roman rule in the Judean War. In March 70 CE, the Roman army laid siege to Jerusalem, and the 2 outer city walls fell in May. 4 months later, the Romans broke through the inner defenses. They devastated the city, killing or enslaving its inhabitants and destroying the temple. Just how Jesus prophesied, Jerusalem was destroyed, which means in the year of 70, Israel was destroyed. In other words, Israel lost its sovereignty in the year 70 when it fell to Rome. Now remember, okay, we've seen that Jesus cursing a fig tree meant Israel would be cursed. We also looked at Jesus' parable about the fig tree, and we showed that Israel would be punished just like the fig tree was cut down. And here, Jesus directly prophesied that Jerusalem would be destroyed. In history, it happened just how Jesus predicted. In terms of the fig tree, what does the destruction of Israel mean? What does the Israel losing its sovereignty mean? It means that the fig tree was what? The fig tree was withered. So we've seen that the fig tree represents Israel, and we've also seen that the fig tree withering means that Israel would be destroyed, and that happened in the year of 70. But everybody, here's an amazing thing. Nowadays, you can find Israel on the map. What does that mean? It means that after a long time, Israel regained its independence. It is now an independent state again. When did that happen? That happened in the year 1948. Many people have a hard time to believe that fact, that Israel exists on the map now. It's because there's no other nation in history that shares that kind of history with Israel. No other country has gone out of existence for something like 1900 years and then become a country again. That's why many historians say that it is one of the miracles of history that this happened, that Israel regained its independence. But this wasn't random. Actually, this was a miracle brought upon by God. In other words, this was the plan of God. Let's go to Luke 21, verse 24. They will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Jesus said that they would be trampled on by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So let's think about what those two things mean. Trampled on by Gentiles, and then until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Now, everybody, what is a Gentile? You may not have heard before. In the Bible, Gentiles means people who are not biologically Israelites. Okay? So most people you meet are Gentiles physically. What does it mean that Jerusalem will be trampled on by Gentiles? That means simply that Israel will be controlled by people who are not Jews for a long time. And that's what happened, right? A series of empires such as the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and finally the British Empire, they controlled that area of land that used to belong to the Israelites. Being trampled on by Gentiles means that Israel, that land would be controlled by people who are not Jews for a long time. But does it say that it would last forever? No, it didn't say that. It said until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. What does that mean? It means that the situation will change, won't it? It means that Jerusalem will not be trampled on by Gentiles forever, but there will be the time where Israel regains its independence. Everybody, it happened. Amazingly, according to Jesus' prophecy, after about 1900 years, Israel regained its independence in the year 1948. This was a miracle brought upon by God. Jesus planned it. He prophesied and said that it would happen. Now let's think about this. Okay? When Israel regains its independence, what does that mean in terms of the fig tree that we've been studying about? It means that the fig tree which once was withered had its twigs get tender and its leaves come out. The independence of Israel is equivalent to the revival of the fig tree. The independence of Israel means that the fig tree's twigs get tender and that its leaves came out. Amazing, right? Now think about this. Why did God want to do that? Why did God bring about such a miracle? Let's check according to the prophecy of Jesus by going to Matthew chapter 24. We're going to Matthew 24, verse 32. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, everybody, what are those things? That means the fig tree's twigs getting tender and its leaves coming out. In other words, the independence of Israel, right? You know that the second coming, is near, right at the door. Why did God revive the once withered fig tree in 1948? Why did God let Israel gain its independence again in the year 1948? It was to show us that Jesus came to this earth a second time in the year 1948. He would be right at the door in the year 1948. Amazing, amazing. That's what the Bible prophesies. So everybody, just think about this. Okay? That's in our past, right? 1948 is in our past. In other words, what does that mean? That means that Jesus was right at the door already. Jesus must have already come a second time. Now, you and I are in between the second coming and the judgment day. So what should you and I do? We have to find him, right? We have to receive him, right? In order to do this, let's find out what it means for him to be right at the door. Should he be born in 1948? Or should he do something else? Let's check according to the words of Jesus in Revelation chapter 3, verse 20. Revelation chapter 3, verse 20. Here I am. I stand at the door and knock. So when Jesus stands at the door, he's here. But what does he do? I stand at the door and knock. If anybody hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with that person and they with me. When Jesus is right at the door in 1948, what will he do? He will deliver his voice. So he's not born in the year 1948, but he begins to deliver his voice. What does that mean? It means he should preach the gospel from the year 1948. 2,000 years ago, Jesus already came to the earth, and he gave us the perfect truth, his voice. But here, when Jesus comes a second time, what will he do? He will deliver his voice again. What does that mean? It means that he should restore the perfect truth that he preached at his first coming. As we've studied, Jesus came a first time, gave us the truth, But in the Dark Ages, that truth was abolished. For example, the Sabbath was changed to Sunday, Passover changed to Easter, and all of those things. That means in the last days, he should restore that same truth that he did at his first coming. When it says deliver his voice, it means the voice of Jesus, right? So when he comes a second time, he appears before the judgment day in the flesh to gather his elect. How does he gather them? He delivers his voice. In other words, he should give us the same truth that he did at his first coming. This is just all incredible. This is just all amazing, isn't it? Everybody, how can we recognize the second coming Jesus? Through the prophecies of the Bible. And the prophecy that we study today shows us something important. Whoever starts to preach the same truth of the gospel that Jesus preached at his first coming is the second coming Jesus. In other words, whoever begins to preach the new covenant, the same teachings of Jesus at the year 1948, is the second coming Jesus. Everybody, the reason why the Church of God that's bringing you this webinar exists, and the reason why I'm able to explain these things to you, is because he already came a second time and restored all the perfect truth. If you want to know the perfect truth, you have to study the Bible together with us in the World Mission Society Church of God. So you can study all the amazing prophecies. And when you do, you can clearly and with 100% certainty believe who the second coming Jesus is. So I hope together we can study more through the prophecies of the Bible and realize the perfect truth. And whenever we have webinars, join continually so that we can bring you more and more content about this amazing truth. I really give thanks to God for letting us know about these things so that I can share them with you. So again, I am Joshua from the Church of God, and I thank you so much for joining this webinar about the lesson from the fig tree, and I hope to see you next time.